I came home to a massacre. Not a human one, but the kind that makes your stomach twist and your blood pressure spike like a rocket. My front yard, once a lush haven of towering oak trees, was now a barren wasteland of sawdust and stumps. A crime scene, but without the yellow tape, just the cold, harsh reality of destruction. And standing in the middle of it, arms crossed, was the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, Karen Whitmore. She was smiling. "Finally, some order around here," she declared, admiring her own work like an artist unveiling a masterpiece. "I took care of the problem for you." The problem? The century-old trees I'd loved since the moment I bought this house. The trees that shaded my home, housed songbirds, and stood as a testament to time itself. The trees that were legally protected. But Karen didn't care about any of that. I took a slow breath, forcing down the storm of emotions threatening to erupt. I wasn't just any homeowner. I wasn't just some passive guy who would roll over and let this happen. And most importantly, Karen had no idea that she had just declared war on someone far, far more powerful than she could imagine. She had no idea I was a federal judge. 3 days earlier, everything had been peaceful. I had left for a business trip, knowing my home was safe, my property secure. But Karen, who had been a thorn in my side since I moved in, had other plans. She had a pathological need to control the neighborhood, dictating every flower, every mailbox, and every blade of grass. And for some reason she had a vendetta against my trees. "They're a mess," she had complained at the last HOA meeting, flipping through pictures of a single fallen leaf on the sidewalk as if it were evidence in a murder trial. A complete eyesore. "Frankly, David, you should be thanking me." Thanking her? My jaw tightened, but I kept my face neutral. Karen thrived on confrontation, on bullying people into submission. But I was not one of her usual victims. I was not a retiree afraid of fines or a single mother too exhausted to fight. I knew the law better than she could ever dream of, and I knew that what she had done was not just an overstep. It was a crime. "You had no right to do this," I said, my voice dangerously calm. She scoffed. "The HOA had every right. Your trees were a violation of community aesthetics, and I, as president, executed an emergency removal." I looked around, noting the precision of the destruction. The roots had been torn up, the ground leveled. This wasn't an emergency removal. This was planned. And the worst part? He was proud of it. I smiled, and that seemed to unnerve her more than if I had yelled. "Well, Karen, I hope you kept your receipts," I said, stepping over a jagged stump. "Because you're going to be paying for every single one of these trees." She let out a laugh, the kind that people use when they think they've won. "Oh, please. You can't do anything. This is HOA jurisdiction. It's in the bylaws. Page 72, paragraph 3. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling. Not through the HOA rules. No, those were insignificant compared to what I was looking for. Federal environmental protection laws. There was one very specific section that Karen should have checked before hiring a team of chainsaw-wielding vandals. "Did you know," I said, my tone conversational, "that these trees were federally protected? They were classified as heritage trees, and cutting them down without proper authorization carries hefty fines, possible jail time, and in some cases civil lawsuits." Karen's smile twitched, but she held her ground. "You're bluffing." I turned my phone around, showing her the statute. "I'm not." Her face went pale for half a second before she snapped back. "Even if that were true, which I doubt, who's going to enforce it? The city loves me. The HOA is on my side." I slid my phone back into my pocket. "Oh, Karen," I said, shaking my head. "I don't need the city. I don't need the HOA. You see, I work with people a little higher up than that." She narrowed her eyes. "What are you talking about?" I let the silence stretch. I wanted her to think. I wanted her to start connecting the dots. Then, as if delivering the final line in a courtroom closing argument, I said it. "I'm a federal judge." The shift in her expression was a thing of beauty. It was as if, for the first time in her power-hungry existence, Karen realized she had made a mistake. A colossal, irreversible mistake. I didn't wait for her to speak. I turned and walked back to my house, already making mental notes. I would need an environmental inspector. I would need to pull records from the tree removal service. I would need to contact my legal team. And most of all, I would need to prepare for the glorious moment when Karen Whitmore stood before a real judge, begging for mercy she so rarely granted to others. She had thought she was untouchable. She had thought she could wield power unchecked. She was about to learn that there was always someone bigger. And in this case, that someone was me. Karen had no idea what she had set into motion. She thought she had won, thought she had flexed her HOA muscles and shown me who was boss. She had spent years terrorizing residents, collecting fines for trivial offenses, and bulldozing over anyone who dared to question her authority. But this time she had picked the wrong person to cross. I didn't believe in immediate retaliation. No, I believed in patience, in precision, in letting the trap close at just the right moment. Karen had given me all the ammunition I needed. Written declarations of her involvement, her smug social media posts, and most importantly, physical evidence of a crime. It was just a matter of letting her walk right into the fire. The first thing I did was call an environmental consultant. I had a strong suspicion that the oaks Karen had gleefully destroyed weren't just old trees. They were protected under both state and federal law, which meant their removal was a serious offense. Within hours I had confirmation. These weren't just trees. They were classified as heritage trees under environmental protection laws, meaning they could only be removed under extreme circumstances and with the appropriate legal paperwork. Karen had neither. I made my next call to a trusted friend at the state's Department of Environmental Protection. He listened as I laid out the details, and when I mentioned Karen's involvement, he let out a slow whistle. "She's in deep," he said. "This is a serious violation. We're looking at a massive fine, potential lawsuits, and possibly even criminal charges." Music to my ears. Karen, meanwhile, continued to operate under the delusion that she was untouchable. She paraded through the neighborhood, soaking up admiration from her small circle of sycophants. At one point, I caught her in front of my house, laughing with one of the other board members. "Finally got rid of that jungle," she said. "Now if we can just do something about that ridiculous lawn of his." Her arrogance was almost impressive. I took my time building my case. I pulled property records, tracking down the original documentation that listed my trees as protected. I gathered statements from neighbors who had witnessed the tree-cutting crew arriving, who had heard Karen giving orders as if she were running some kind of military operation. I even tracked down the landscaping company she had hired, and after a few carefully worded questions, the owner admitted on a recorded call that Karen had insisted she had full legal authority to remove the trees. It was all coming together. But the real turning point came when Karen, still drunk on her own power, decided to take things even further. I received a letter from the HOA, signed by none other than Karen herself, informing me that I was being fined for replanting without HOA approval. She was trying to charge me for fixing what she had destroyed. That was the moment I knew she was finished. With every piece of evidence in place, I filed my lawsuit. It was a beautiful document, thorough, airtight, and absolutely devastating. It wasn't just a simple civil case. No, I was suing Karen personally for property destruction, as well as the HOA for overreach and unlawful enforcement of rules. On top of that, the Department of Environmental Protection was hitting her with state violations, and there was even the possibility of federal charges looming in the background. When the official notice was delivered to Karen's doorstep, I made sure I was outside, casually watering what little remained of my front yard. I watched as she ripped open the envelope, expecting another routine HOA complaint to deal with. I saw the exact moment she realized what it was. Her face paled, her mouth tightened, and for the first time since I had met her, she looked genuinely afraid. She stormed across the street, waving the papers in my face. "You can't do this," she shrieked. "This is ridiculous." I calmly turned off my hose and met her glare with a serene smile. "Surely I can. And I already did." She fumed, flipping through the lawsuit as if she could will it out of existence. "You're suing me? Personally? You cut down my trees, Karen. My federally protected trees." I let the words sink in. "And then you fined me for trying to fix it. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences?" Her confidence wavered, but she wasn't ready to back down just yet. "The HOA will fight this. We have lawyers." "Do you?" I tilted my head. "Because as of this morning, the HOA board members have been notified that they're also named in the lawsuit. I'm guessing they're not too thrilled about that." As if on cue, her phone rang. She snatched it up and I could hear the frantic voice on the other end. From the way her expression soured, it was clear her so-called allies were already turning on her. I let her stew in silence. Let her process the reality of the situation. She had spent years ruling this neighborhood, treating people like peasants under her HOA kingdom. But she had never faced someone who could actually fight back, who had the legal knowledge and resources to dismantle her little empire piece by piece. When she finally lowered her phone, she looked at me with something dangerously close to desperation. "We can work something out," she said, her voice quieter now, more measured. "Maybe a settlement? I can talk to the board, we can—" "Oh, there will be a settlement," I said. "But not on your terms." The days that followed were a whirlwind of chaos for Karen. The HOA board, realizing the magnitude of the lawsuit, distanced themselves from her as quickly as possible. Some even resigned outright, hoping to avoid the legal fallout. Karen, who had spent so long thinking she was untouchable, suddenly found herself very, very alone. The media got wind of the case, and soon local news was covering the HOA tyrant's legal nightmare. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out before suddenly found their voices, sharing horror stories of Karen's reign of terror. Fines for having the wrong shade of curtains, threats of legal action over garden gnomes, absurd power trips that now, in the light of day, made her look completely unhinged. Karen was no longer the queen of the HOA. She was its biggest liability. And the best part? The court date was set. I had been patient. I had been meticulous. Now it was time for the final act. The day of reckoning arrived like a thunderclap. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people took their seats, eager to witness what had become the biggest scandal in the neighborhood's history. Karen Whitmore, once the untouchable queen of the HOA, now sat at the defendant's table, her usual smug expression replaced by one of barely contained panic. She had tried to delay, to negotiate, to throw her weight around, but none of it worked. The HOA board had abandoned her, desperate to save themselves from the fallout. Her once loyal minions now whispered behind her back, pretending they had never supported her in the first place. And as if fate itself had a sense of irony, the very judge presiding over the case was an old friend of mine, one who had no patience for HOA overreach. I sat at my table, calm and collected, my legal team beside me. Karen, in contrast, fidgeted constantly, her lawyer whispering furiously in her ear. From the way she clenched her jaw, I could tell she was still convinced she could weasel her way out of this. Then the trial began. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the facts. The trees she had destroyed were federally protected. The HOA had no jurisdiction to remove them. She had approved the action without consulting any legal authority, and worse, she had attempted to fine me for trying to replant them. The evidence was overwhelming: emails, text messages, witness statements, social media posts where she bragged about cleaning up the neighborhood. Her lawyer tried to argue that it was a simple misunderstanding, that Karen had been acting in the best interest of the community. But the judge wasn't buying it. "What authority did the HOA have to remove those trees?" the judge asked, flipping through the case files. Karen's lawyer cleared his throat. "It was an executive decision based on neighborhood aesthetics." "The defendant isn't a licensed arborist, correct?" the judge interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "Well, no, Your Honor, but—" "And was there a legal order for the removal of those trees?" Karen's lawyer hesitated. "Not exactly, but—" The judge turned to Karen. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you aware that unauthorized removal of federally protected trees carries not only civil penalties but also potential criminal charges?" For the first time since this ordeal began, Karen's entire body tensed. She stammered, her eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. "I was only doing what I thought was best for the neighborhood." The judge wasn't impressed. "That's not your decision to make. You violated environmental laws, property rights, and HOA regulations themselves. This was not an accident. This was an abuse of power." The courtroom fell silent. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. He finally understood. She had lost. The final ruling came down like a hammer. Karen was personally liable for the damages, over $150,000 in fines and legal fees. The HOA itself was ordered to cover additional damages, which resulted in immediate emergency board elections to remove the last remnants of Karen's influence. And to top it all off, the judge hinted that criminal charges could still be filed depending on the environmental agency's final assessment. Karen sat there, her face drained of color as reality crashed down around her. The HOA, the very thing she had spent years controlling, had turned on her. The neighbors she once terrorized were openly celebrating her downfall. She was no longer the queen of the community. She was its cautionary tale. And the best part? She had to sell her house to pay the damages. By the time the dust settled, Karen was gone. Her house, once the throne of her self-proclaimed empire, had a for sale sign in the yard within weeks. No one missed her. In fact, the neighborhood threw a small celebration when she finally moved out, an unofficial Karen is gone party. As for me, I was offered the position of HOA president by the newly elected board. I politely declined. I wasn't interested in ruling over anyone. I was just happy to sit back and enjoy my newly planted trees. And if I ever saw another Karen try to rise to power, well, let's just say I'd be ready.